So in accounts payable, the vendor account can be paid against like an open wallet. And like we've noted, the actual department, any department, in noting that they have authority, let's say up to $10,000 or $100,000, could make a consultant, say for $25,000, approve it themselves, put it to accounts payable, and no one would be the wiser. Now, if people aren't reviewing budget to actual as much, as long as people are staying within their budget, it usually doesn't come up. And it's very surprising. I mean, I've seen organizations where people will go through, actual consultant person will go through this massive, long type of process to get hired at the organization, but yet an accounts payable vendor where the person just signs an invoice and sends it in, that goes through no process. It really is, does that person have authority? Do they have budget? Put it through. So when looking at billing schemes and corruption, they really top the charts. And looking at that corruption figure alone on its own, it's a heavy percentage. Then taking that asset misappropriation, kind of going to the next slide here, you'll notice that the billing and corruption tends to be one of the highest ones of all of the asset misappropriation. So you can do some statistical math here if you want, but for the most part, what we're trying to see here is, I think I tried to calculate that 23% of all worldwide fraud is a vendor billing scheme, and then when you add on to that, this 23%, add on to this other 21 or 22%, you could almost argue that a lot of the vendor type fraud out there is accounting for about 50% of all fraud. Again, don't hold me to these statistics completely, as my quick mental math here is not that good, but when you look at it, it's pretty close. And 2010 Report to the Nations provided all of this info, and it really is a great read if anyone's not seen it, for looking at all of the different categories of why this spend is happening, where it's happening. And what I like to do is line up the 2006, 8, and 10 versions and try to look, because there's different statistics that they gave you depending on the year. Just to round out a couple more slides on vendor-related fraud, and we'll talk then about how it relates to recovery. From a corruption, check tampering now, if you throw that one in, billing scheme point of view, accounts payable not only attributes to most of the fraud out there, but it's also the highest fraud from a dollar's point of view going out of the company. Again, a lot, notice how the $100,000 limit is there. I wonder, on the median side, I wonder a lot of times that's very close to some of the limits that are out there. Now, fraud, though, does grow over time. I mean, within a month, it might be 10,000, but, within a year, it probably is going to be 100, and 2 years, 3 years, etc., it can grow even larger. Once people get comfortable, once they start seeing they can, go to these limits, maybe increase their budget and start making some of these phony services, it's something where the value can go up over time. And I do find it grows more exponentially, and as when you look at the patterns of over time and how that particular fraud occurred. And now let's talk about how cost recovery interrelates with fraud detection. In taking a look at strategic sourcing, and this is just a sample of a phase, an initial phase of a strategic sourcing, and when you look at benchmarking and taking a look at what are you spending now to what's out there in the the world, and developing some baselines and where you are in relation to baseline is fantastic, and something that a cost recovery firm will do, a service will do for you as well, and you can start doing it at companies as well. So it's not something that you always have to go outside for. You have to build a case for doing it internally, and that's kind of where starting out a bit externally works well. But looking at this process, this can really help find various frauds, one of them being a kickback fraud. And when you look at it, kickback frauds are off the books. I mean, it's things where a person is getting a favors on the outside, be it could be anything from games to watches to anything, cash. But in catching that, it's very difficult, except if you do an audit of that vendor. That's one way. and we've talked about that a bit. And by auditing that vendor, you might see a payment to Joe within the company directly, and that's odd. And another way, though, is to do this baselining of your costing to what people are paying in the market. And again, without going through a good RFP process, healthy one, you'll never find this stuff. And when you look at kickback frauds too, I mean, most of the people that are kind of striking the deal are also a lot of times ordering the goods. And again, be it within procurement. So I mean, things can happen within procurement itself, of course, and you have to be careful. And I think it's good to know that these types of services are coming around the mountain at some point in the organization, because then it really deters a lot of folks from ever doing anything bad in the first place. Again, in taking a look for this kickback fraud, though, you're really going to look whether or not that deal was struck. And in many ways, the actual cushion in between what the company is paying and, let's say, what they should be paying is something that you're really looking for here, because if you can get rid of that cushion through strategic sourcing or doing your own internal investigation, you can actually get rid of all of the benefit of the fraud in the first place, and then the fellow doesn't even want to do the fraud. So again, these are ways to catch it, and baselining is a great cost-saving, cost-recovery measure that can also find fraud. So turning our focus to the healthcare industry, there are a variety of ways that healthcare fraud can be enacted, and you hear about it in the news, Medicare fraud, etc. That same Medicare fraud can happen to your organization. There could be services not being rendered by providers, and other types of upcoding. We'll talk about unbundling in a second as an example. And there are various ones here. I mean, keep in mind, you're either paying a premium as an organization, and that premium can go up if fraud happens, or you're self-insuring it, which means you're paying it yourself, and you need to be careful about paying for this stuff yourself. So I think that we need to kind of take a look at this. The actual third-party administrator who's paying it isn't really in a position to look for fraud as much as you'd like them to. And there can be a lot of gaming of the system that happens because of that. So one example would be unbundling, and unbundling is where, let's say, you go for a physical, and in that physical you get blood taken and you do lab work and etc. You could just charge it as a physical, which is a lot of times that's what has to happen, but then what ends up happening is there are these other services that can be billed after the fact and separately, and then in many ways be viewed as an unbundling of the service so that you can get paid more, because that physical might be discounted at one rate, and in this way you're able to kind of break it up into two services and obviously make more money and game the system. So before jumping into all the cost recovery categories, I wanted to lastly note how these types of audits, by cost recovery audits, can have such an impact in detecting for SOX type issues and financial statement reporting issues by finding these types of frauds, to be able to kind of get them out of the system, but also to say to yourself that we have done our due diligence. We've kind of met our fiduciary responsibility by looking at where all this major spend is, be it at a healthcare third-party administrator, or be it at a large vendor of ours that we obviously do a lot of work with. We need to be kind of careful and make sure that we're looking at that spend and that that's not being wasted in some way, or turning into fraud. A lot of times these types of audits can again detect the fraud and in a way be like a proactive whistleblowing hotline for the organization. The other benefit I see, though, is that a lot of SOX work, sometimes controls, it tends to kind of get pushed a little bit under the carpet with cost benefit. And I think sometimes being able to quantify the cost benefit and being able to report back to management, we lost this much money or that much money due to this, you can get a lot more push for improvements within the organization.